Bow with me, please. Father in heaven, thank you so much for your wonderful love and the sacrifice of your Son for our sins. Father, we thank you for this time today to be together. We pray your blessing on our efforts. Give us success. Thank you for this food we're about to eat. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, everybody. Please be seated. Rex, Claudia, hi. Welcome from the Western Oklahoma. You know, when I advertise this pack to speakers who are coming, I always let them know that we have people here from all over the metro and the state attending. And it's really true. Every week we have people coming from all over the place. So we've got Weatherford and Clinton represented here today. That's pretty cool. Speaking of representatives, we have Representative Lewis Moore is back there glad-handing people. He has endorsed Dan Fisher for governor. And then we have Representative Bobby Cleveland here, who says he is also voting for Dan Fisher. And now we're going to cover some various and sundry announcements. Give us a Turnpike update. Try and keep it under 2 minutes.
Yes, sir. Okay, for those who don't know, the Oklahoma Turnpike Authority, right, it was founded in 1947. We voted for it, but House Bill, I think it was 933 in 1953, gave us the current turnpike structure, what we have today. Basically a group of unelected officials that have more rights over your property than you do. So they operate outside the rule of law. You have no representation. They violate your freedom to contract and not to contract. And they violate representative government because they're unelected and appointed. So with that, I received my letter of intent or coercion the other day. I knew it was coming. And there's a group called the Victims of Eminent Domain. They've been doing very good with their fundraising. They're actually changing their infrastructure. I brought their cards and an article that I wrote on the impact of Oklahoma Turnpike Authority in our public school systems, and also impacts our municipalities, because you lose all that ad valorem. Then there's that bow wave until they do equalization, and then everybody gets taxed. So with that, the Victims of Eminent Domain information is up there. Do not lose heart. God always does great things with small groups of people and the truth. Amen? All right, thank you.
Okay, let's talk about the elections just briefly. A couple of things. One of my jobs here, I think, is to keep us all from going crazy and to put a positive spin on all the stuff that happens. So let me attempt to do that as we talk about the elections. Here are all the bonds that passed Oklahoma City yesterday. If you add them all up, as you can see, it's almost $1 billion that voters decided to pass yesterday in Oklahoma City. So let's find a positive spin on it, if you don't mind. What I did was I ordered all of these bonds in order of the rate or margin by which they passed. So your top vote getter was 73.4%, all the way down to funds for the arena, which just barely passed at 50.7%. And I asked myself, is there a pattern here? And guess what? There is. I'm cynical. I'm pessimistic about politics and things, and I just assumed they would all pass at 70%, but they didn't. So that means that the same 40,000 people that showed up to vote actually tried to exercise some discrimination in how they voted and read the issues. Because look, all the ones in yellow at the top that passed by a large margin, I think most people would agree are actually proper functions of government. Now, of course, it's stupid that they would borrow that many millions of dollars to do those jobs, but at least people were thinking in terms of, okay, bridge and streets and police, that's the proper function of government. And then you have libraries in the middle, which you could argue either way. And then the stuff at the bottom, like public transportation, economic development for jobs, a civic center, and an arena, they didn't pass by as much. Now, they still passed, but folks, this means there's still hope. People are still thinking about what we should actually be spending tax dollars on. So there's my silver lining. Hope that's helpful to you. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, now let's talk about the special elections in the House and the Senate. There were a couple that we were kind of watching. And this is interesting to me that there was a national Democratic legislative campaign committee. A big pack out of Washington, D.C. was actually raising money off of these local races in the states, including Oklahoma. So this was one of the flyers that went around trying to raise money, saying we want to help these Democrats down here in these little old federal districts like of Oklahoma and Mississippi and turn them D for Demon Rat. And you can see on the bottom right there is Jacob Rosekrantz of Norman, Oklahoma, who defeated the Republican last night. So here are the numbers. House District 46, that's along I-35 in Norman. The Republican was Darren Chambers. We did not endorse him, of course. And then there was Rosekrantz, the Democrat, and you see he pulled 60.4% of the vote. Hey, we need more Democrats up there. That's all there is to it. We need to teach these liberal Republican leaders a lesson, in my view. All right, the other one that we were kind of watching was Senate District 37. That's Sand Springs on the northwest side of the metro Tulsa area. There were a slew of candidates in this one, 6 or 7, I lose count. But the one we thought would win did win. That's Brian O'Hara, establishment, a lot of big name support, a lot of dollars. And he pulled in 41.86% of the vote. Interestingly, it was Philip Nolan who came in second place. This is the husband, I believe, of Jadine Nolan, big-time government educator supporter who's been in the House. And then we actually interviewed Nicole Nixon, and she actually registered higher than all the other candidates in the list without any money even. So that just kind of speaks to her charisma and slick website, but she did a pretty good job there. Now, normally, of course, there would be a runoff because nobody got 50% of the vote. But as it is, O'Hara takes it without a runoff. I'd also like to point out that only 2,000 people voted in a Senate district where you have over 78,000 people living. So just a handful, just a few dozen people are going to decide who the next senator is representing that area. Here's the silver lining on this one. The big-time government educrat is Phil Nolan, and he did not win. So those teachers and those education unions like to try and scare legislators and say, you better do this or else. Or else what? You're going to come in second place? Okay, they don't own everything. And we made this point last week when we had Linda Murphy here. We actually have another teachers union now competing with the mainstream one that has almost as many members. So they don't own and control everything. We don't have to necessarily fear telling government educrats that no, competition is good. Freedom and free market is good, and we're going to go that way. You guys can do that. All right, so that's all the announcements I had. Any other comments for the good of the order regarding elections before we get our most excellent speaker up here? Charlie, you have anything you want to pop off and say?
You remember when Sally Kern got herself into a lot of trouble because she said that the homosexual agenda is more dangerous to America than terrorism? And she's 100% right in it. She was right then. I've stood by her the whole... You want to know why? Do you know what this was about? You ever heard of Tim Guild, the .com billionaire from Colorado? He and 5 of his other millionaire .com friends made a decision that they were going to put millions and millions and millions of dollars into campaign races, not congressional races for the most part, taking out social conservatives at the state level. They flipped Colorado from a Republican state to a Democrat state. And what we're seeing right now in Oklahoma happen is 2 things. Number one, Republicans are pissed off, and I mean mad. I am mad about these Republicans that go down there and vote for tax increases and bigger government. Any Republican wants to know, I can show you where you can make so many cuts in government, it won't even be funny. So, number one, Republicans are mad and they've stopped voting. They're stopped involved. And number 2, these Democrats are well organized, race by race, and they're going out and they're working hard and they're beating us in that way. Now, general election, they can't focus their forces that much. But on these one-by-one races, they're forcing them. So it's 2 things. The anger of conservative Republicans at the legislature, one thing, and the other thing is the Tim Guild factor and all these people raising money to defeat these social conservatives, and they're doing it.
Tell us what you really think. Okay. Our PAC has officially endorsed Dan Fisher for governor. Many other legislators are getting on board and influencers across the state. Of course, Randy Brogdon has also endorsed him. So we're looking forward to the support of all those liberty lovers who supported him in 2010. And if you're excited about this, if you're motivated by this, I've got a few bumper stickers in my bag. We have donation envelopes where you can give to the campaign. Even if it's just 10 or 20 bucks, you get to get counted in the head count when we report September 30 that we've got 700 contributors. That's probably going to scare some other people out of the race and consolidate him as a viable candidate so we can make a run at the guys you saw up on the screen, the pro-lifers who just regulate the murder. And now, let's talk about the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. They exist to support the free market. We have their president, Jonathan Small, who is not small at all here, but large and tall in his intellect and stature. Jonathan, please come talk to us today about higher education. Have fun.
Thank you, sir. I always love it when John introduces me because I need to get him to tell my parents that introduction. They'll be proud. And so I generally have to come here because after session, based on public comments from some public officials, we're the bane of the existence of Oklahoma. So want to talk with you today about an extremely important topic. What's funny is I actually have some relatively good news on this topic. And so one, because you guys deserve it, under no circumstances am I going to try to do this presentation myself. I brought two guests with me, Brandon Dutcher, who's been at OCPA forever, and he's been studying this issue for quite a long time, and then Trent England, who you know as well. So I want to talk and start with a couple of things, and it's something that Charlie mentioned. And I want to talk to you about something that's going on in Oklahoma, and that's a narrative. And this narrative that is being pushed by very prominent Republicans is that Oklahoma is dead last. Oklahoma is dead last in higher education funding. It's dead last in common education funding. It's dead last in total state tax collections. So you guys all know, and you actually saw it on that screen, Oklahomans in general are skeptical of government. That's kind of their knee-jerk response. So whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, they have to convince the public that we're all backwards, that all the other civilized people in the country, they're funding their organizations much better and their government much better than we are. So that's why you saw Representative Leslie Osborne declare about a month ago on TV that Oklahoma was dead last in state tax collections. OCPA began to look at that, and what's funny is we actually went to an ironic place to disprove that massive departure from the truth. In this case, the federal government was actually reliable, and there's this really wonky organization called the Census Bureau, and even with all of the violations of your rights as an individual in the United States of America, the Census Bureau does have information about total taxes collected in Oklahoma and the rest of the country. Fascinating, Oklahoma is not dead last in total tax collections. In fact, Oklahoma ranks 31st. Now, I don't know about you, but that's not 50th. Now, I was homeschooled from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade, so maybe in some other school's form of math, I know not CHA, 31st is 50th. So another, you guys know that I have a good friend, David Boren, and he and I have a very good relationship. He's sent me a personal letter, in fact. And as you know, Bourne and I had a public spat when he prominently invited and used your taxpayer dollars to promote to Oklahoma students Harry Belafonte. You remember Harry Belafonte. He said that black conservatives like Clarence Thomas and Condoleezza Rice, people like me, were house Negroes or traitors to their race. I was wild and crazy enough and outlandish enough to think that that didn't become a public taxpayer-supported official in Oklahoma. But you know that Boren has been promoting the idea of we're dead last. You remember? That was the whole reason for the Boren tax, that Oklahomans beat very soundly at the polls. So I want to present some financial information to you, then I'm going to turn it over to Brandon and Trent, because I think there's some things that are not necessarily financial for you to understand why it's so dangerous to give higher ed more of your money. So one of the things that Boren says is he comes out in a newspaper right before he wants to encourage, some people might use other words, trick the OU Board of Regent members into voting for yet more tuition and fee increases. He states emphatically, after giving those regents very little time or heads up on information, that Oklahoma is dead last in higher education. And the reporter, who happens to be the spouse of the press secretary of the governor, sometimes I jokingly refer to this reporter as David Boren's press secretary or OU's press secretary, reported that as fact, said we're dead last. We now know that there was a little bit of collusion between Boren and this reporter at the largest newspaper in Oklahoma. But it turns out, according to their own report, Oklahoma was not dead last. Again, Oklahoma was 31st in state support for higher education. And this report didn't even go into the fact that in Oklahoma, our state public higher education system has 70% more non-instructional workers per capita, per private sector worker, than the national average. Not only were we 31st in raw dollars, we were 29th when you adjusted for cost of living. Their own higher ed report also said, hey, so this notion about Oklahoma cutting higher education spending higher than any other state. And so Trent and Brandon had to warn me beforehand, because actually this group would actually be excited if we were dead last in higher education funding. But unfortunately, I'm going to give you guys a heart attack. It's not true. We were 31st, actually, 29th when you adjust for cost of living. But here's what's fascinating. In 2012, we actually ranked 20th. So higher ed's own report said, hey, by the way, caveat about the states that have cut higher education spending the most the last 5 years. Those states, other than Illinois, who's a tax and spend debacle, those states are all significantly impacted by the oil and gas industry. So one, I would say, so although the legislature has had difficulty in other areas, we're very proud, and we think it's the work of you all, our work. Oklahoma lawmakers have cut higher education appropriations. We celebrated it after session. Oklahoma lawmakers have actually cut state higher education appropriations by a combined $217 million annually over the last 5 years. So you should call your lawmaker and tell them, keep it up. If you guys need to cut more, higher ed should be on the chopping block again. So this special session, the legislature ought to go back and take more from higher ed, since they're still building more buildings. So I think that's something that you guys should all be happy about. The legislature has gotten it. The legislature is on the same page. We worked with Sooner Poll. They're bipartisan. To this date, they're not affiliated with any candidate for governor. And we asked Oklahomans to rank and prioritize funding. So it was pretty comical, because as you would have guessed, everybody ranked teachers. So we gave them the 5 biggest areas, which were K through 12 education, higher education, transportation, public safety, and healthcare. As you might have guessed, 46% of Oklahomans think that K through 12 is the highest priority. I'm not saying that us in this room should or shouldn't agree with that. That's just what the polls show. Next was transportation. Was second. Then third was, I believe, healthcare, public safety was fourth. What's fascinating is only 5% of Oklahomans felt like higher education should be prioritized and should avoid cuts. This poll is roughly around 400 people. We all kind of laughed hysterically in our office because likely what happened is the pollster happened to call 2 higher ed employees and didn't know it, and they responded that higher education should be a high priority. So it's clear from Oklahomans that they view that higher ed spending is wildly out of control. If we get a chance, we'll show, you've heard this statement that higher education is being decimated. Actually not true. Trent pointed out, actually by looking at the governor's executive budget book, that they've increased over the last 5 fiscal years $800 million to their general education budget in higher ed. That doesn't include any money for all the Saturday activity that imbibes people to turn over more of their dollars and their children to be indoctrinated by our public higher education system. That doesn't include any of that football stuff. It also pointed out that, for example, the regents pointed out that OU has increased tuition and fees more than 150% since the legislature gave them the authority to again in 2003. The total, when you look at since inception to date, OU has increased tuition and fees on your children, your grandchildren, your nieces and nephews by 194%. What's fascinating about OU's budget is they comment a lot about the fact that, and again, so OCPA, because, people, they kind of castigate us, kind of like they castigate you guys. So at OCPA, we love to use their own numbers. Because if you're going to pay for a financial audit report, we ought to be able to look for that financial report that you say makes you worthy of the new investment that you want. What's fascinating is that OU criticizes the legislature for that. Finally, in fiscal year 2016, the cuts that the legislature made to higher ed amounted to $20 million to OU. Now, I need to remind you, OU's total budget, according to their financial statement, is $1 billion a year. But that little $20 million that these guys cut over here, Norman campus doesn't exist anymore. I don't know if you knew that. No one's being educated there because of that $20 million. Here's what's fascinating. In 2007, OU was collecting $148 million in tuition and fees. They're collecting $292 million right now. So let's assume for a minute that these lawmakers are derelict in their duties. OU has increased their tuition 7 times the amount that the legislature just cut them last year. But they're still saying they need more money. With that, I want to turn it over to Trent next to talk about a couple of free speech related issues, and then I want Brandon to follow him and give you a couple of the recommendations that we've been pushing at pushing for at higher education, and how you can count on us to continue to take the arrows from Boren and everyone else. Trent.
John says, "Step into the light." Yeah. Thank you all for having us. I did want to point out too the important handout in the back. We have a bunch of handouts in the back, but Jonathan was referencing some of the financial numbers, and we have this back there, and you can see just how much their funding has gone up in higher education, even as the appropriation has gone down. We did a series of articles during the legislative session about how that has been the case in a lot of agencies. A lot of the agencies that the governor and others have talked about being cut are actually spending more money than ever before. Their appropriation may have gone down a little bit, but the actual money that they have to spend has gone up. It's important to know that. I wanted to say just a little bit about the larger question about higher education. Right, because this, I don't know about you, but this can be a tough issue for me sometimes. You go back to our founders, and I consider myself a scholar, a respecter of America's founding fathers. And you go back and you read what they wrote. They talk about higher education, and Thomas Jefferson founds the University of Virginia and sees this as one of the three most important things that he did in his life. And George Washington talks about the importance of higher education, and many, not all, but many of the people who framed our Constitution thought that this was really important. And we get this thrown back at us today. We talk about reforming higher education, and we talk about giving them less money, shoveling less tax dollars into Norman and Stillwater. And people say, "Oh, you are turning your back on Thomas Jefferson, or your respect for the founding fathers is somehow hit or miss, or is opportunistic." And I want to talk in general terms and then about one example in Norman that I think is really troubling and something that we can actually do something about in the short term. But one of the things we have in the back is this copy of Perspective Magazine, which has a couple of articles around the theme of, is illiberal education a public good? And of course, I think the answer is obviously no. Right? I think that the question that we have got to drive back to is, look, if somebody wants to set up a resort, and they want to invite 18 to 22-year-olds to come and spend 4 years at an all-inclusive resort, and they tell them, look, it's going to cost you $40,000, $50,000 a year, but at the end, we're going to give you a paper that's suitable for framing. If somebody wants to do that, private investors want to get together and do that, I have no problem with that. I'm a free market guy, right? But if somebody, if they, maybe they might be subject, in extreme cases to civil liability for fraud or something like that. But if somebody wants to take my tax dollars and tell me, hey, we're going to set up a 4-year resort, we're going to give people a piece of paper at the end, we're going to charge taxpayers billions of dollars, we're going to charge families tens of thousands of dollars. Well, I'm going to have some questions about why that's worthy of public support, why that's worthy of being a public institution, and I might actually go back to Thomas Jefferson and try to figure out whether what they're doing is actually education or not. And I think we need to hold our public higher education institutions to a higher standard. I raised this question in a little social media debate just this morning. I think, look, if these schools are turning out citizens, if you go back to Thomas Jefferson, you look at what, and he very detailed, he says, look, we need these institutions because we need people to understand what it means to live in a self-governing society. We need people to understand how to be representatives, how to be statesmen in a self-governing society. Right? It's pretty easy. Are they producing that kind of citizen, that kind of servant leader in Norman and Stillwater and our other institutions, or are they not? And if they're not, why are they public institutions at all? Right? The founders, Jefferson in particular, actually give us great tests for this. But what are they actually doing? And I'll just give you one example. You've probably heard a lot of other examples, and we see a lot on the news from, some of the even crazier things that happen on the coasts. But did you know that at OU right now, there is a research center set up in partnership with Beijing Normal University, which happens to be a part of the Chinese government, right? There's an organization. If you go down to Norman and you say, I want to study Chinese culture, they'll say, well, that's great. We have a great institution where you can do that. We have the Confucius Institute. And these exist all around the country, but one of the oldest and most active is right here in Oklahoma at OU. A Confucius Institute funded in part, supported by the Chinese Communist government. And so if you go down to OU and you say, I want to study what's going on in China right now, that's where they'll send you. I've done some interesting searching on the web. You can go to Google and you can search just one specific website. So you can go and I've searched just the Confucius Institute's website, but all of the pages, all the information on their website. This institute that's supposed to teach young Oklahomans about what's going on in China. If you search their website for the word freedom, you know how many results you get? Anybody want to guess? 0. If you search for democracy, you know how many results you get? 0. Apparently these are not issues in China today. If you search for Tiananmen Square, you know how many results you get? 0. Right, we talk about the Great Firewall in China preventing people inside China from access to the truth about what's going on in that country right now. There's a Great Firewall in Norman, right? And this is supported with our tax dollars. I mean, this is not only higher education failing to meet the basic test that qualifies it as a public interest, as a public good. This is higher education working explicitly against American interests, against what they're supposed to do. At least if they want to be a public institution, right? At least if they want to claim that they're fulfilling some kind of a public good, right? So, and this is something that the legislature, I think, could do something about, right? This is something that we can actually do something about in Oklahoma, is take an interest in what is going on campus. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brandon Dutcher. He's going to talk more about what can we actually do, what can our legislative leaders do to turn this system around back towards something that Thomas Jefferson might perhaps recognize. Brandon.
Thank you, Trent. I hope you all are listening to Trent weekday mornings from 7 to 9 on AM 1640 The Eagle. If you're not, you see why you should be. So I'm supposed to talk about a few solutions. If you are a 5-year-old kid thank you. If you're a 5-year-old kid in Sunday school and your Sunday school teacher asks you a question, any question, what's the correct answer? Come on. Jesus, you can't go wrong. Just say Jesus. I mean, and so if you ask me how to reform higher ed or common ed, the answer is school choice. You can't go wrong with that. But that's not, I don't want to be, sorry, Charlie. Good to see you again, man. It's been a long time. So I would suggest that school choice is the best answer, but there are others. And, you know, the left likes to say, well, OCPA never has solutions. They're just criticizing. We have lots of solutions. In the back, one of the handouts, Jonathan and I, at the beginning of this year's session, had a piece with 16 possible reforms. I invite you to pick it up. I mean, some of my favorites, there's ALEC model legislation that would require universities to offer $10,000 bachelor degrees. Not $10,000 a year, but $10,000 for a total degree. Reduce the non-teaching overhead that Jonathan talked about, require professors to teach more, create a teaching-only tenure track. There's ALEC model legislation, capital spending transparency. So there's all sorts of good ideas. Just this month in perspective, I advise you to pick this up in the back. We've got 13 more reforms for higher education. My favorite is from my friend Jonathan Butcher at Heritage, who suggests that since OU has this mandatory diversity training in which they indoctrinate all incoming freshmen, they should require that OCPA's Trent England go speak about the First Amendment and free speech during that diversity training, which I think is a great idea. So yes, we do need to encourage lawmakers to reform higher ed in some of these ways. We need to encourage regents to reform higher ed. But at the same time, I think we also need to be working on giving parents and students more choices. Milton Friedman, of course, the esteemed economist, said that restricting higher education subsidies to schooling obtained at state-administered institutions cannot be justified on any grounds. Any subsidy should be granted to individuals to be spent at the institutions of their own choosing. And he's right. I mean, if they're going to spend, if you're going to appropriate how many ever, $1 billion a year for higher ed, well, don't give it to institutions. Give it to students and let them decide. I mean, why should our political leaders discriminate against Oral Roberts University or Oklahoma Baptist University or St. Greg's? This is too fun to pass up. I don't have time to do the whole thing, but let me give you I'm going to give you a quiz, and you can just shout out. This is an article in our next perspective. If you don't get it, I encourage you to get this magazine. But I'm going to say the name of a journal article. This is scholarly research at Oklahoma's tax-funded institutions. And some of them are real, some of them I made up. So you can vote real or fake. I'm just going to do a few. Music, religion, politics, and everyday life. The tensions of utopianism and pragmatism in movements for change. Okay, that's fake. I did pretty good on that. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Try this one. Towards queering food studies. Foodways, heteronormativity, and hungry women in Chicana lesbian writing. That's real. Yeah. It's a lady in the OU Honors College. OU Honors College. Try this one. Transgressing the boundaries. Military masculinity and the effects of whiteness. That's fake. I got y'all. I am good at this. All right. Try this one. Hetero-cis normativity and the gendering of transphobia. That's OU again. That's real. Try this one. The man with the Midas touch. The haptic geographies of James Bond's body. That's real. That's OU again. My alma mater. Last one. I could go on. Try this one. Queer Theory on Campus, a critical ethnographic exploration of campus-hosted drag shows. That's Stillwater making its contribution this time. So yeah, so this is we hear about research. We need research, and we do need research. Meteorological research is important. Cancer research is important. But do people have any idea the sorts of people we're employing to do this sort of? I mean, why should they be doing this on our nickel? And why should Oklahoma's overwhelmingly center-right taxpayers be subsidizing that sort of stuff and not subsidizing the sort of stuff going on at Everett Piper's place, or the studying of the American founding at Oral Roberts University or at OBU, or why discriminate against equally valid institutions of higher education? So just in closing, I'll say, don't take it from Milton Friedman. I want to quote an Obama-admiring, big government, tax and spend economist here in Oklahoma, who says we should expand higher ed vouchers. He says, instead of giving money directly to institutions, we should give it to students in the form of vouchers. These vouchers could be used as a credit at any Oklahoma college or university, public or private. The money will follow the students. Turns out we already do this somewhat on a smaller scale with Oklahoma's Promise, formerly known as OLAP. We have the Oklahoma Tuition Aid Grant. We have federal Pell Grants. But if we truly want to encourage Oklahoma colleges and universities to recruit and retain Oklahoma students, we should use a voucher system modeled after Oklahoma's Promise. That's from our friend Mickey Hepner at the University of Central Oklahoma. One of your pals, Jonathan. So this is not something that's going to happen tomorrow, but let's keep that in mind, and pushing that drives pressure that would solve a multitude of sins over here that I just mentioned. Back to you.
So with that, you guys know how we work. It's completely boring if we just drone on and don't take questions from the audience. Just a couple of things. One, so I want to reiterate, OCPA is very proud of the fact that we got accused of urging the legislature to engage in cost avoidance this session, as opposed to pining for new revenue. I assure you that we'll continue in that posture. We feel like when Oklahoma's economy suffers 21,800 oil and gas manufacturing jobs that were lost from September 2015 to September 2016, at a time when Oklahomans lost $13 billion in taxable income, at a time when Oklahomans, get this stat, and this is all from the Tax Commission, at a time in 1 year alone, Oklahomans cut their purchases subject to sales tax by $4.1 billion just so they could tread water. So we think that when Oklahomans have to go through that sort of pain, when large companies in Oklahoma themselves cut over $1 billion in investment and spending in 1 year, we think that urging cost avoidance is okay. We'll continue to stand for that. we'll take it that the executive branch keeps charging us for looking at everything other than gaining recurring revenue, which is tax increases. So we encourage you to look for that. We have a solution. First of all, the legislature shouldn't come in for special session. All coming in for special session does is just help the Scott Inman for Governor campaign and the executive branch's legacy campaign to get jobs after they leave. So we think that just like in 2010, when the Supreme Court slapped down another bad tax idea that OCPAC was opposed to and predicted was illegal, guess what? When Brad Henry was governor and Scott Meacham was over the treasurer's office, somehow the Healthcare Authority magically found a way to make it through the fiscal year for about the same amount of money, and the budget was significantly less. So we think that if you can use your ingenuity to figure out how to borrow and drain $240 million from the constitutionally protected rainy day fund, that you ought to be able to figure out a way how to not drain more tax dollars from Oklahoma citizens. And so we think that's the context of how we're going to approach spending ideas, and happy to take any questions. Mm-hmm. Yes, Charlie.
Jonathan, yes. One of the reasons I'm so excited about Dan Fisher's candidacy for governor, if elected, he will not be putting people on the Board of Regents because they were $5,400 donors or whatever that amount might be. He's going to be putting people that are have ideological understanding of this junk that goes on, and will stop that if that is a possible thing. How important is it who we put on the Board of Regents in Oklahoma? Maybe people like Brandon Dutcher and some others.
No, I think all you have to do is look at Mitch Daniels. Mitch Daniels is now the president of Purdue University. For those of you that don't know, Mitch Daniels essentially left the George W. Bush administration after 2 years as head of Office and Management and Budget because he was frustrated with Republicans. One of them, a congressman here who you immediately know his name, who continually drove up spending. He leaves the George W. Bush White House. He becomes governor in Indiana. He proceeds to lead Indiana in just beating the snot economically out of Chicago. One of his claims to fame is cutting by, I believe the number is over 15,000 government employee positions out of Indiana, the state of Indiana. He had this crazy notion that if Indiana families and the Indiana private sector figures out how to use technology to lower employment, that government should somehow do the same thing. He's now at Purdue. He is issuing tuition increase freezes in some areas. He's forcing professors to teach more. Although after what we've heard about what some of our professors are teaching, I don't know that would be a good idea. But he puts ideologically aligned. It's extremely important. Here's what's fascinating is the term for a Board of Regent member lasts longer than a governor who would serve 8 years. Any others?
Amen, brother. Preach on. So, I know this is a drinking crew, and you're probably all familiar with Dos Equis, the Mexican beer. They are known for their advertising campaign, the most interesting man in the world, right? We have our own right here in Oklahoma, and his name is Charles Sasser. Quite the adventurer all over the globe. He has written a new book called Crushing the Collective, and he will be here next week talking about that book. So bring your friends, your family. He is super interesting. The most interesting man in the world in Oklahoma will be with us next week. So I'd like to invite Ken Blood up here. If you're comfortable, stand. We're going to close in prayer, and then we'll see you all next week.
I was certain that the most interesting man in the world was not going to be Charles Key. What I'd like to do is say the benediction and then say a blessing over you. Lord, thank you for this country. Thank you for our heritage. Thank you for the institutions that you will still allow in this country. Strengthen the church. Allow us to have a revival. In the name of Christ we pray. Now if you'll allow me to say a blessing. For it's from the Old Testament. Some of you know it. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. And may the Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. Amen.